due to pandemic fears of COVID-19, which seem to be impacting us right now online. We decided that nothing will stop us, and so we scheduled this event. IAWRT is an organization comprised of professional media women in 54 countries, and a whole lot of them is on right now, including our Vice President, Abir Sahadi, and Violet Gonda, our Global President, will join us also. You can visit us at www.iawrt.org, and Patty's here. Our Global President is, I said who she was already. And so it gives me the greatest pleasure to introduce our moderator, Patricia Newberry, known as Patty, you know, the 105th President of the Society of Professional Journalists and Director of Journalism at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. That I'll have to talk to you about, is Miami, Oxford, and Ohio. Welcome, Patty.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and apologies for the rough start. My computer was completely frozen. My mouse would not work. And thank you to Jennifer Royer with SPJ headquarters, who walked me through that and got us back together here. So I'm very happy to be here to lead this conversation, looking at the 25th anniversary of the Section J, Women in the Media, of the Beijing Declaration. And we have a star-studded panel to introduce you this morning to have this conversation. So I'd like to quickly introduce folks. Michelle Ferrier, if you would just do a wave, there you go. And Michelle, am I saying your name correctly?
Michelle Ferrier.
Ferrier, thank you very much. Michelle is with the School of Journalism and Graphic Communication at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, that's in Tallahassee. And she's also the founder of Trollbusters, among other hats that she wears. Purna Sen is the executive coordinator and spokesperson at UN Women on Addressing Sexual Harassment and Other Forms of Discrimination. Joining us from New York is Purna Sen. Thank you very much, Purna. Next, we have Courtney Racheal. Courtney is the advocacy director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and that's in New York. Thank you very much for being with us. Next we have, is Diana Nastasia with us?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Hi, Diana. We've only all met each other once or twice on Zoom ourselves, so I'm getting familiar with your faces again. Diana is an international lecturer and scholar and faculty fellow at Southern Illinois University, which is in Edwardsville, Illinois. Let's see, Racheal Nakitare. Yes, on the line with us, Racheal Nakitare. Do we know, Sheila, whether Racheal was able to be with us? Not hearing or seeing Racheal, so if she comes later, we'll stop and do a introduction for Racheal, who is with public broadcasting in Kenya, television broadcaster in the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation in Nairobi. And finally, we have Mahi Ferrier. I'm probably butchering your last name, Mahi. And Mahi is the youth representative at the United Nations and getting her master's in student public media at Fordham University in New York. So thank you to Mahi for joining the conversation. Thank you. Did I miss anyone who's joining the conversation that I should? Right. So just kind of the rules of the road here. I'm going to lead us through a series of questions. They're very broad. We're going to start very broad, as you can acknowledge here. To talk about 25 years of change for women in the media is a very big topic. And so we'll start broad and then ask our panelists here to offer information in response to the questions that's based on research, based on observation, based on your own studies, based on your own experiences, based on what you see in your newsrooms or your organizations that respond to these broad themes. And then after about an hour, we want to bring other participants into the conversation. So if you're new to the Zoom platform, The best way to engage is to put a question in the chat field, right? So you'll see the chat function down at the bottom of the screen, the little bubble. If you would just insert your question as we move to that part of our time together, then we'll react to those. And then certainly if you want to open your microphone at that point to offer your question verbally, that will work for us. So the first question is 25 years of change. I left the newsroom 25 years ago. That's when I moved over to academia. And so my own anecdotal observations on this topic are very stale, right? 25 years, lots of change in the newsroom, but I'm hoping that our guests have more to say. So let's start very broadly, and any of the panelists, what have been, in your estimation, the biggest changes for women and media, women in the media, over the last 2.5 decades? Who will start us out?
Okay, I'll jump in, Patty.
Hi,
and
Michelle.
try to provide some retrospective here. I think when we're talking about women in the media, particularly, and more specifically, women of color in the media, I see we've had over the past 25 years some progress in terms of women's voices represented in management, an increase in women's voices as sources in the stories, and obviously from the perspective of our journalism schools, 60 to 70% of our graduates are female. And so the profession itself, we are training up a generation that is very much female to perform this kind of work. Progress-wise, though, however, beyond the small bright spots in terms of women in media management roles, etc., I have not been particularly favorable towards some of the movement. We have not made a significant progress in terms of really representation in the media, as owners of the media, as producers of the media, as representatives in the media. I think we're sorely lacking in terms of female representation. And from my perspective as the founder of Trollbusters, we're seeing some significant pushback online to journalists, women thought leaders, women politicians, and others who come under attack because they are female and are using online channels to disseminate information.
Mm-hmm. So some progress, but limited in your estimation, and not in some of the key areas: management, production, source community, ownership. Yeah, definitely ownership. All right, let's continue to set the stage here. Any other panel members? 25 years of change. What have been the outcomes? Purna, thank you.
Thank you, Patty, and thanks for persevering with the technology. Just so you're aware, while you were trying to come back in, a lot of us were saying we were having difficulties with internet. So hopefully we will hold. I just flagged that mine's been playing up, and if you lose me, I will just dial back in on my phone. Thanks to everybody, and congratulations on making this happen online. I think it's wonderful. I'm not a media specialist, so I speak as an observer. And as a colleague of colleagues, as a colleague of people in the organization who are media specialists. One thing I just wanted to contribute to this framing part on a global scale, since that's how we work. I just wanted to flag a study that was done a few years ago across more than 100 countries, in a way reflecting on what Michelle was saying just now. They found that, well, given the media's particularly important role in reproducing or challenging or fracturing existing very conservative stereotypes around gender and sex inequality, but also race and others, a staggering 46% of news stories in print, on radio and television was seen to uphold gender stereotypes. This was a study conducted in 2015. They found that only 6% actually spoke about gender inequality. And behind the scenes, they found that 73% of top media management positions are occupied by men. This is looking at 522 media outlets. And less than 1/3, looking more broadly than journalism, less than 1/3 of all speaking characters in film are female. And I think what can change in the last 25 years is the importance of cyberspace around journalism and the pushback and the contestation that happens there. And one thing I hope is just starting to happen, Michelle sort of touched on it briefly, is around a very gradual awakening to issues of intersectionality, which I think is very slow, but I think it is core to the discussions we're having around women in various sectors. You know, not all women are the same, have the same experiences and so on. And I think that sort of subtlety and complexity is very much missing in the mainstream discussions and actions. So I just wanted to chime in to support what Michelle was saying and just globalize that a little bit. If useful, we can share a link to that study afterwards.
Yeah, certainly. That'd be great. And others as we set the stage here.
This is Diana. I would like to add some research-based information. I'm a researcher. I came to the United States from my home country of Romania about 18 years ago for my PhD and stayed as a researcher and academic. Several things I wanted to add are that if we look at United Nations measurements, the Gender-Related Development Index, the Gender Empowerment Measure, and the Gender Inequality Index, all of them are showing some reduction in gender inequality across countries and regions. So we have made progress, yet significant gender gaps remain, whether we are discussing media issues or other societal issues overall. If we are talking about studies specifically of media and communication, the Global Media Monitoring Report, which started in 1995, so at about the time of the Beijing gathering, the Global Media Monitoring Report was simply looking at who makes the news. And in 1995, the rate was 17% women. The study is repeated every 5 years across the globe with a large number of researchers, journalists involved too. And the progress has been relatively steady, but very small. So by 2000, there were 21% women in news media. By 2005, 23%. By 2010, 24%. And in 2015, there was no progress, so we were still at 24%. This year is another year of the GMMP study. So I'm really curious to see if there is real progress again. But I would make the prediction that there might not be much progress beyond about a little less than a quarter in regards to representation of women and participation of women to the news media. There have been a number of other studies. Another one that I would like to mention specifically is the IAWRT Global Report on the Status of Women in the News Media, because it looks at women in the profession, women journalists. And glass ceiling is something that works for women across the 59 nations studied, with the situation being that women occupy around 25% of the top management jobs and around 36% of the ranks of reporters, men holding, as I said, nearly 2/3 of jobs. This is a report conducted by Carolyn Byerly as principal investigator, and the report for which I served as the director for the Eastern European area. And just based on that experience, I wanted to say even how much pushback there is in terms of collecting such data from media organizations, from the top managers of media organizations that are primarily men. So all of this data shows small progress, but yet still a lot of space for improvement left.
Mm-hmm. Right, so somewhat stagnant, and we'll come back to that theme that we've kind of reached a plateau where there hasn't been a lot of advancement in terms of movement into management, movement into ownership, or just generally being represented in fair, equitable ways. So before we move on, any others want to generally set the stage here? Courtney, Mahi, anyone I've missed? Yeah, Courtney, thank you.
Thanks, I'd be happy to. So I am the advocacy director at CPJ, but I also worked as a journalist for many years in the Middle East and the United States. So I think what we've seen at CPJ is more journalists than ever having to take safety issues of concern. And so I wanted to kind of focus in on a few issues that I think have become really important for journalists, especially women journalists, over the past 25 years. So we're seeing that actually what it means to be a journalist and where that takes place, and therefore the types of threats that they face, have evolved. And so one of the things that is a common experience by what appears to be the vast majority of female journalists and female identifying journalists is online harassment. We did a survey of journalists in the US and Canada, which showed that online harassment and digital security threats were at the very top of their list. Now, granted, those are in cases where imprisonment and killing are less of a concern, but there's also a link between physical violence and online harassment. But we've also seen that in surveys, informal surveys that other groups have done around the world that we know from our reporting on a regular basis. And one interesting thing that stands out is as CPJ, we systematically track the killing and imprisonment of journalists. And we see that women are very, very underrepresented in the percentage of journalists who are killed and imprisoned. And we don't know why, but I think it would be interesting to put that into conversation with the studies that IWMF and Carolyn Byerly and others have done, looking at the roles, the journalistic roles that, and beats that women journalists get, the stories that they're allowed to cover, the opportunities they're given, and see whether there's any correlation there between what types of work that they're doing and the threats they face. And it's much harder to track in a systematic way things other than killing and imprisonment, like sexual harassment, like sexual assault, like intimidation, which we certainly do on a qualitative ad hoc basis. But there are no groups who are able to really do that in a globally comprehensive way, which means that information is less visible. Those threats are less visible because, it's easier for reporters to report on global numbers. It's easier to see the real threat, I think, that, that we can see in the killing and imprisonment of journalists. I do think there's been a vast awakening in the past couple of years about how real the threat of online harassment is, especially to women journalists. What does that do to their ability to cover topics, not even just sensitive topics, but really any topics, and how many governments around the world are using disinformation and coordinated harassment campaigns to undermine journalism broadly, but especially targeting women journalists. We know that their threats are sexualized. And so I think we need to think about that in the context when we talk about, what does the industry look like? What are women journalists dealing with? It is a very, if you're a woman journalist these days, you should expect that you will receive threats online, that you will probably get threatened with some sort of sexualized violence, and that has to become now a part of doing your job. And so I think that's, with that I can.
That's really good context and is going to get us to our next topic here. So of course we're all happy to know that women are not, that women journalists are not being killed and imprisoned at growing rates. But what does that say about their place in the world of journalism? Are they not getting the kinds of assignments that put them in those positions? But we really want to talk a lot about the online harassment issue and how that harms women, harms their career prospects. But I see Mahi's hand is up and she hasn't had a chance to weigh in yet. So we'll do that. And then we're going to move quickly to the topic of online harassment, what that looks like, and the actual tangible harm that brings to women. Mahi.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney, for bringing that up. What I want to say is specific about what Courtney just jumped in and bring a context about the global south, about Brazil, where I'm from. Last week, we had a case of a Black woman journalist being harassed online. And Black women in Brazil, Black women journalists in Brazil are really underrepresented. Like less than 26% of journalists are Black women, and less than 12% of them are editors, either in online newspapers or in physical newspapers. And when they are present, they really face threats and attacks online. So we know that the society does not take easy when women journalists make mistakes online. And when a Black woman journalist does that, the repercussion and the results of that online is even heavier. So last week, a journalist called Basilia Rodrigues, she's from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro. She was live and she said that Chile was not border with Brazil when she was not part of South America when she was talking about the COVID-19 in South America. But what she meant is like Chile was not bordered with Brazil, but is part of South America. So that mistake repercuted on social media, and she started receiving many threats and attacks to her family, to herself. Accusations not based on her professional skills, but her appearance, her race. And we have to remember that we are talking about a country that had 400 years of slavery, right? One of the last countries to abolish slavery on the world. So there is a clear history of not just gender inequality, but of racism. Well, so I agree with all that my colleagues said. So I just wanted to bring this perspective from Latin America to that conversation as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. So a small error in how she reported a story became a big moment for her to be harassed. And is it your perception, Mahi, that the combination of being Black and female in Brazil adds additional vulnerabilities to being attacked?
Yes, especially if you look not just at the data about women journalists, but about women in general in society. In the past 10 years, violence against women after the domestic law was implemented has declined, but the violence against Black women in Brazil has increased by 30%. So if we compare all those data in different parts of the society in Brazil, we're gonna see that there is different of the way the society is treating gender equality and women. And we are talking about women, Black women who are in the public sphere, right? Women who they are in the TVs and the screens every day. So they are more, we could say, vulnerable because we are seeing their face, we know who they are, right?
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move to this topic. And I know that Michelle is equipped to talk about this in particular, this topic of online harassment. What does that look like? How has it changed over the life of the internet? And then why are women media players particularly vulnerable to online harassment? Let's start with Michelle.
Great. I want to thank you, Maria, as well as Courtney, for really diving into this topic, because not only is it very timely, but it's critical to understanding why I think we have not been able to gain traction in some of these online spaces. I want to first talk a little bit about some of the research that Trollbusters has conducted global research that looks at this issue of online harassment, not only on the impact on the individual journalists, but also the impact that it has had on the media enterprise in and of itself. And so when Courtney points to an increase in the types and quantity of attacks against journalists, Trollbusters was formed about 5 years ago, just as we were seeing a significant uptick in the types of online attacks and the ways in which people were attacked. And the research that we did in 2018 really looked globally at what was happening, and gender was the key factor along which people felt that they were being attacked. 78% of the respondents to our survey said that gender was the main reason for the types of attacks they were seeing, and that was in the US, since that was 68% across the globe. And so that was the highest percentage. After that became the stories and the beat that people cover. And so the topics that they cover, whether it's racial issues, whether it's immigration, whether it is economic issues and health, poverty, those kinds of issues also tend to attract those that are using misinformation and disinformation and discrediting campaigns to try and minimize the work of the media itself. And then particularly, I want to also point to one of the other top reasons that journalists said that they felt that they were under this environment of escalating threats had to do with the current media environment, including accusations of fake news, not only by the president in the US, but by leaders across the globe. And so journalists from our survey really indicated that this work has not only had an effect on them because of the work that they do as journalists, but because these attacks are very personalized and come after particularly women with very sexualized, very violent attacks on them as well as their family. And one of the things that research really showed was that a significant number of women, at least half, have thought of rethinking their careers and leaving journalism as a result of this kind of behavior. And so we have some significant impact of this kind of behind the scenes, invisible attacks that affect the way people do their work. What stories they choose to cover, whether they get to continue to cover a particular beat, whether they go out and cover, do a live shot on their own as a backpack journalist. Even student journalists have been attacked as a result of this online harassment, and it's all designed to keep them offline and keep them from having a platform and having a voice and sharing the stories that they are able to tell. And so there's a significant chilling effect on the news enterprise itself as a result of female voices, and particularly voices of color, being under attack.
I'd like to ask what news organizations are doing in reaction to this steady harassment, to this campaign of harassment. Do employers take it seriously? What do they do to protect women in their ranks, to allow them to continue to either remain on the beat that they choose or to go on live shots, right? What are the employers doing to assist on this?
It's been a really mixed bag over the past 5 years. Some larger organizations have put in place some physical safety as well as some online safety training. Some organizations have used physical conferences to be able to provide some digital security and digital safety training. Ultimately, though, while prevention helps, it does not mitigate your vulnerability to attack. Let's just put it that way. And the types and ways in which people are using media creatively. So not only nasty tweets, but coordinated campaigns across platforms can have a significant effect on individuals and their ability to do their work. Media organizations themselves are less prepared to deal with the emotional and the psychological, the effects on your ability to do your work. And journalists as investigators are really the worst people to troll, because we get hold of the issue and we don't let go. And oftentimes our work is put aside as we're attempting to try and find out who's attacking us, why they're attacking us, and to try and defend against these attacks. It takes away the time and energy that we have to do our actual reporting work.
Yes, thank you, Courtney.
Yeah, just respond to that question, because I think that we've really seen a sea change in the past few years with how newsrooms are perceiving this topic. When I first started at CPJ 6 years ago, you know, safety was hardly even on the agenda for a lot of news organizations, you know, if they weren't, say, sending their staff onto dangerous assignments in a very traditional conception of what traditional looks like. But I think when we talk to journalists, what we're seeing is that actually the majority of the journalists that we surveyed in the US and Canada had not received security training. And despite the fact that they thought that online harassment was their biggest concern, I think that is still something where we are in the process of socializing newsrooms to this being an issue. I would say my perception is that more newsrooms are aware, but they are still putting in place the practices, systems, support, and expertise needed. We also hear, especially, you know, it's one thing to be in a newsroom that has that sort of support, but what about freelancers? Like, that's a whole nother dimension, because they don't necessarily have, you know, a newsroom to support them. And so this is something that, you know, we've been paying a lot of attention to as well, because if you're a female freelance journalist, you're also going to have to be thinking about, you know, how do you keep yourself safe? How do you talk to an editor about that? You know, we've held panels on this topic around the world, and we still hear from women journalists that they're not comfortable talking about this with their editors, that they still don't necessarily feel like they're taken seriously. Again, I do think that is shifting, but it's also very cultural. One of the things we're trying to do is really highlight the link between online harassment, which encompasses a broad range of things, from, you know, annoying tweets to doxing and putting out personal information, to, you know, real threats, to drowning out the entire ability of that journalist to be visible in any other way online. So, you know, we are seeing an improvement, but there's still a long way to go. And when we think globally, you know, there are definitely different, you know, different capacities around the world. Some countries or, you know, states lack the legal mechanisms needed for these threats to be taken seriously. And so, you know, even if the newsroom is there to support, there might not be anything to do after that. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing is the responses that we have, as Michelle alluded to earlier, are really preventive, but they're preventive, and a lot of times it's putting it on the individual journalist. You know, keep track of what personal information is out online, secure your accounts, all of this. So, you know, newsrooms, I think, are getting a little bit better, but they also need to help with that prevention. But frankly, there are huge realms of online harassment, especially when they are led by state actors in a coordinated way, or inspired by state actors in a coordinated way, where, you know, regardless of how much prevention you do, it's not really going to make a difference. So we also need to look at what the tech platforms can do. And we've been having many conversations with the major platforms about how to address online harassment, about, you know, technological solutions and tools that can be used, about policies to be in place, and understanding that, you know, you can't only look at an explicit threat. Sometimes there are implicit threats, and trying to figure out with them how they can address that. And of course, then working at the legal regulatory level to make sure that there are frameworks for addressing serious types of threats.
Right, so this is a giant issue, and we could take the remainder of the hour, I think, to just talk about this, but we do want to move along the conversation to some other aspects of women in media. Clearly, this is a moment at which many resources are in place, but many more are needed to address this real threat to women. And I'm buoyed by hearing, Courtney, that your group is working with the large platform providers on some solutions at the tech level. That's great to know. And of course, the solutions, I'm sure, are wide-ranging, but are impacted by the downsizing of media, right? Do media organizations have the resources in-house to deal with this, to create policies, to follow through, to support their individual journalists? All of those things are real and moving targets. So Purna, you wanted to join, and I do see a hand up with Abersadi, right? And we definitely want to get to you, but I want to get through some other questions, and we'll definitely come back to you. So Purna, you wanted to continue this vein?
Thank you very much, Patty. By the way, yes, your picture had frozen, but you're back now. I just wanted to, because this is actually, you know, not being a journalist or in the media, but this is the area that my role is particularly focused on. It's what's happening in terms of harassment and what can we do about it. And I just want to first of all pitch at the level of eradication, ending and elimination. We've no interest whatsoever in limiting our vision to reducing or mitigating what's going on in terms of sexual harassment. And I want to remind everybody in this discussion that people aren't targeted for harassment, my brief, particularly sexual harassment, by accident. It's not an accidental accumulation of microaggressions that we see in terms of patterns of sexual harassment. People are targeted because they are members of a specific group, whether that group is female, Black, immigrant, disabled, around their sexual orientation, around their age. These are therefore forms of inequality between groups that are manifest in these forms of harassment. And so they are also forms of discrimination. Now, there are international provisions and standards around discrimination, not least of all the CEDAW provision, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, issues around disability. There are many, many legal provisions at an international standard that we need, I think, to get out more fully and to understand more fully. Now, earlier somebody was talking about national laws. That we have in our last publication issued something about laws in different countries. The quality of those laws really matters. So ensuring that our legislators are informed and briefed by people who are experts in these subjects is absolutely crucial, because otherwise you get really the wrong content. One example we're talking about is the central concept in sexual harassment being unwelcomeness and not consent. And because we understand sexual harassment as on that bigger continuum of violence and sexual violence in particular, there is a slippage into saying, well, I didn't consent to this, or she did consent to this, or at least I thought she consented, she didn't say no. That's not what sexual harassment is about. And for journalists in the media sector, no doubt there are commonalities around sexual harassment from all the other sectors where we're learning also. And of course, women in many places leave their jobs because of this, because it's harder to report than it is to do many other things. The costs of reporting are high, the outcomes are unknown, you're often required to have secrecy, the length of these reports and investigations are ridiculous. What we have to do, I think, is shift responsibility onto employers and institutions to end inequality and discrimination against the people who work for them. It's their obligation to uphold these standards. And that's also what we're trying to do. We have, the other point I just wanted to raise was around training. Several people have talked about the need for training and how people aren't getting training at the moment. 30 years of work on sexual harassment has shown how ineffective most training is. We have to think about what sort of training is appropriate and effective here. Mostly, in many places, training has been used to expunge employer liability for sexual harassment happening, which is entirely, well, of course employers are liable, but having a policy and providing training, which has been their go-to responses, is totally inadequate. We have just issued actually be up next week, some guidance on reviewing this. We've reviewed the training over 30 years. We've come up with some guidance with what works best, and we will be holding a webinar on that actually next week. So something might be of interest to you in this group. And lastly, I do think there is an essential requirement to look at prevention. It is absolutely part of that discussion around what I call the 3 E's: ending, elimination, and eradicating. We shouldn't have a vision that goes any lower than that. But prevention is actually a responsibility, not of the person who's targeted, who can try and minimize risk, but it's the obligation of the institution in which the perpetrator operates to ensure that they do not do this, and to ensure that if they do, they are held to account. So the whole accountability discussion has to be more central. And of course, there are ways in which we can talk about prevention without making the victim or survivor responsible for that work. And what we talk about is collective ownership of this project of change. The only other thing I wanted to say just very quickly is there is a lot of, we're all extremely correct and I think on the same page about pointing out the shortcomings and where things are not working for women in the media. But I also want to point out, and you'll say maybe more about this in the next part of the conversation, is that the media, in particular the social media and some parts of traditional media, also made Me Too possible. It is where the space that has been taken spontaneously, without formal leadership, without funding, without a structural organization, a space that has been taken and occupied profoundly to change the public discussion and expectations on this. I know you're going to come to this in a moment, so I just want to flag that here in our discussion about what's happening.
A very good segue, because that is our next topic. But before we leave, Purna, if you would put into the chat field a link to the upcoming program that you just mentioned that focuses on training and so forth, okay. If you have it, or we can follow up on that.
Yeah, so just to say what I can do is we can put links to the existing publications which talk about the overview, but the publication will be up next week and I will tweet it and we can email it to you for the circulation.
Well, the webinar that you mentioned, webinar that's, yeah, great.
We'll do that, thank you.
All right, so I did want to go to this topic of Me Too, right? We're more than 2 years into the Me Too movement that we often say was launched by the New York Times coverage of Harvey Weinstein. And that started a new conversation, at least in the United States. And those of you who study the issues globally, you can help us understand if this has spread to other countries. But in the United States, we've had a important, high impact conversation about Me Too in all kinds of industries. Yes, in Hollywood, but also in media, right? This has definitely infiltrated the world of media, even though originally the coverage was other persons, it's now come back into the world of media. So I'd like to have your thoughts on how the Me Too conversation is affecting the role of women in the media. Is it helping on any of the issues we've touched on so far? Is it having a detrimental effect, right? Is it giving the trollers of the world more ammunition to come back at women media players? So let's start. Me Too movement. How has it affected anything we're talking about here today?
Well, let me just start with a personal example. Right now, all of us are at home on COVID watch, keeping ourselves safe, but I also am under a death threat that I received at my home last week. It was from a coordinated campaign of people who are attempting to discredit me and ruin my reputation, using a variety of platforms, social media and others, to be able to do that. And so I not only study and service journalists who are under attack, but have experienced it and understand exactly the emotional and psychological, as well as long-term effects of this kind of attack on a person and their family. Because we are women, the attackers come after us and our families, and the death threats that I received were not only targeted towards me, but also my family as well. And so the threats are designed to not only create fear and intimidation, but also to get you to rethink the work that you do and the risk that you're taking with your life and the life of your friends and family who are undergoing this type of thing. The second thing that this type of attack does is it's very isolating. How do you combat this kind of activity online in a solo way, which is the way that management typically has folks respond to this type of attack? Take down your account, don't respond, don't do anything while you sit back and watch your reputation and your work and your face be discredited and torn apart online. So I think it's really important to understand that in order to be able to combat online harassment, we have to provide better mechanisms for identifying and supporting people who are under attack, being able to provide the kind of online pushback necessary to be able to correct the historical record, because it's not just the initial attack or letter or email or tweet or whatever may come. It's the longer term suffering under the silence, whether it is trying to respond to yourself or whether it's as a mandatory reporter in a higher ed institution. I've reported sexual assaults on my students, and that has put me in a very precarious position vis-a-vis my employers because of the ways in which I've tried to protect my students from online attacks, online threats, online exploitation, and other kinds of things that happen, unfortunately happen in a higher ed environment as well. But they are not in a position to be able to investigate and or solve for these types of issues and understand them. And so my thought that I'd like to leave us with in our conversations is not one, self-training, because prevention does help. But even as somebody who is armored up and did everything necessary to try and lock down my identity and my location was still disclosed, and I received death threats at my home. So I don't think trying to, as Parva said here, use employers who are using training to expunge their own liability. They have to provide protections, they have to provide training, and they have to provide long-term support, psychological and emotional, to people who are undergoing this type of threat. It is nothing to play with and has long-term effects on the individual and their families.
Mm-hmm. So very sorry to hear about your personal situation and wishing you well, of course. Others in the conversation here, Me Too movement for good or bad in what you've seen?
This is Diana. I would like to just add a little bit of the international perspective on the issue, particularly because there have been several scholarly reports, most notably one from the Columbia Journalism Review, on the fact that while the Me Too movement is important in regards to addressing sexual harassment issues in many places around the world, Eastern Europe being one of them, sexual harassment threats or allegations are not taken seriously. They're not taken seriously at governmental level, across organizations, including media ones, and really societally wide to some extent. In the IAWMF study on the status of women in the media professions, one of the biggest issues we had in Eastern Europe in data collection was that whenever we brought up the sexual harassment policies, the media administrators would say, this is not an issue we would have in Eastern Europe. This is an American invention. This is something that Westerners bring up because they want to, I don't know, destroy our institutions or have something to tell us that we are doing wrongly. And we have no such issues. And as an Eastern European woman who was an academic in Romania before I came to the United States and dabbled a little bit in journalism, at least in training of journalists at that time, I know every woman in Eastern Europe will tell you 10 stories of sexual harassment, yet the organizations for which they work do not admit sexual harassment even exists. That's not a problem. That's a Western construct. That's an American invention. So there is this discrepancy between women on the field who suffer sexual harassment on a daily basis and the institutions and even the governments that do not address this issue because they don't consider it exists. And feminist scholars know that when we can't name an issue, we don't have an issue. So what these governments and organizations are trying to do is not give the opportunity to admit that something even exists, so then there is no problem to address, right? The Columbia Journalism Review that I was mentioning earlier particularly addressed the ways in which Vladimir Putin was deriding sexual harassment issues, the things brought up by international organizations that there need to be sexual harassment policies broadly in every country of the world and so on. Again, saying this is not something we need to consider in any way whatsoever. So if we look at the international situation, there are many resources available in the United States. There is a lot more awareness and training, in spite of the fact that there are real threats to journalists and scholars who study the issue, but in other parts of the world, there is just silence. There is silencing. There is no way that you could talk about the issues at all. And if you look at the IAWMF status or report on the status of women, albeit that it's 10 years old now and it doesn't address online harassment because there was no such thing at that point yet, you will see how much of the data collection was even just hindered by the fact that organizations, that was an area in which organizations literally refused to provide any data whatsoever. It was easier to even get salary information, wage information, than sexual harassment policy or training or anything, just because that was not an issue, right?
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask Racheal to come into the conversation now. She was delayed. This is Racheal Nakitare. She is with the public broadcasting, sorry, I don't have my Kenya public broadcasting in Nairobi. And so we'll just put you on the spot here to give us a brief overview of conditions for women media players in your world. Either you can take it countrywide or your employer. I know 25 years is a long time to think about, but are conditions better in the last couple of decades for women in your organization than they had been previously?
Thank you, Pari, and sorry everyone for being late. First, I mixed up my timing. I thought I still had time, and again today, because of the corona virus, we have a curfew in Kenya, which starts at 7 o'clock, so the roads are completely packed. Everybody's trying to get home, so I'm very sorry about that. But coming to the question, Things, I would say, have changed a little, not so much, have changed in the sense that we have more women in media than we had 25 years ago. We have more women reporting even on hard stuff than they did 25 years ago. But I think what persists is what I would say incidences of violence against women, which for me have just been carried from the offline to the online spaces, where we're seeing a new trend in that in the past, 25 years ago, the media spoke to the public. The public never spoke back. Now, because of internet, it's provided the opportunity for the public to speak back, to react and to send back and to message and to sometimes even be ahead of the media. Now, what we are seeing there is a bit of a disadvantage for the women is that then instead of remaining professional, we're getting a lot of online harassment for women. A lot of the public is trying to intimidate women not to be able to come up and speak. And by abusing them or by posting their pictures or by sharing their status, a lot of the professional women, without giving names, can be giving a trail on a very important professional subject. And then what follows are sexual abuses, being told about your family, being told about which husband you've left and which husband you went with, being told about how you're dressed, like all manner of abuses so that they get derailed. And so you see a lot of the women, a few have developed hard skin and are able to cope, are able to talk back, are able to stay the course in terms of professionalism. But a lot, especially the young ones that are coming up, get intimidated. And what they opt to do then is to get out of that space and say, you know what? This is not ours. Coming to mainstream, you'll see that a lot of the women are in the middle cadre. And when it comes to management, it continues being a boys' club in Kenya. Like the top management of the women of the media houses and the ownership of the media houses is predominantly in the hands of men. And so a lot of the decisions are made in the boardroom. And so then a lot of the decisions that affect women are looked at as petty and are being trivialized. A good example, and I came when Diana was talking, I'm sorry, but I'm sure she has already shared about the research that IAWRT was involved in on gender mainstreaming in public broadcasting, where we looked at issues of stereotyping and management. And we realized that the issues of stereotyping are still on the rise, mainly because the culture has not changed and the perceptions are the same from the public. And so they just carry those now, they carry them along so that you find them being carried even to management, to boardrooms. Luckily, where I work, KBC, thanks to IAWRT, has a gender policy. Because of the work that we did in terms of research on gender mainstreaming, we ended up influencing and coming up with a policy for the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, a gender mainstreaming policy. In the process of coming up with the gender mainstreaming policy, it actually occurred to us that there was a lot of sexual harassment, and that was just an entity on its own. And so in the same breath, we actually also came up with a sexual harassment policy. Beauty is, it is working. I sit on the gender mainstreaming committee, and I know that we're actually using the policies that we came up with to cushion, especially the women that bring the cases to the committee about sexual harassment.
Good to know. So slow progress. Many of the trends that we've talked about here in other countries and in the United States are likewise in place in Kenya. But good to know that there's some progress, that a committee is taking allegations seriously and investigating them and so forth. So I want to come back, before we open to questions, which is coming up very quickly here, I want to come back to Mahi. You are in journalism school. Those of us in the world of academia, we know that our classrooms are 3/4 women to 1/4 men, sometimes even more. And so I wonder what you are seeing as a younger woman going to a media program in the United States. Is there hope for opportunities? Are young women discouraged by some of the things we've talked about, the online harassment, the somewhat limited, some impediments in the path to getting the beat that you want, etc.? So just give me a bit of a feel there.
Yes. My program is actually really different. It's much like what Michelle said in the beginning. I think we are like 70% of the classroom are women. And it's a really diverse program. So we have different voices from different international students. And based on my experience, what I've seen is that young journalists, young women have used social media to bring different voices and to different spaces and to talk about their communities and other issues that sometimes are not covered by the mainstream media. And in Brazil, that is being really intense from the favelas of Brazil. So I've seen Black women, like women from the favelas using digital media to cover issues that usually the big newspapers, the big newsrooms do not cover. Or when they talk about the favelas, when they talk about those marginalized communities, it's usually only a language about violence, about violation of rights. But there is culture, there is knowledge production, there are so many interesting things happening there, like it's happening everywhere, in any place that we can cover a type of news we can do in the favelas, we can do in those spaces as well. So what we call them journalism periféricos, that would be the journalism from the favelas. So they are usually production from their own communities to the communities. And they are like currently, because they are, all of us, even Brazil experience this whole situation with the coronavirus, the mainstream media only started covering those, the specific needs of the favelas, like lack of running water or hygiene products, after the young women journalists started covering that in the favelas and used Twitter with a hashtag coronavirus in the favelas to raise awareness of what was happening. So only after that we saw organizations, the mainstream media, big corporations became involved to bring, to meet the needs of those communities. And I think that's where I see hope. Like I see their own community speak for themselves. They are their own sources. They are the producers. They are the journalists. They are the people who are producing everything. They are still really underfunded. They don't have enough funds as the big corporations, so they don't have all the structure that they would need, because they are not even seen sometimes as professional organizations, because they are led by young people, sometimes for people who do not have a degree in journalism, but who have like led those spaces, who have bring the news to their community since they are really young. And this is a type of journalism that is bringing solution. They are not just talking about what is going wrong in their communities, but they are bringing solutions. So when they talk about the flood zones, the flood seasons, they are not saying, oh, we already know what is going to happen in March. It's flood season, but what are the solutions? What can we do? What the whole community can do for themselves to hold the government accountable, to bring a solution to solve that problem. So as a young journalist, I think my hope is there, that not only my generation, but the generation that are gonna come after me continue to do those kind of work. Like we are gonna use like our own voice to speak for ourselves. And I really see an opportunity in digital spaces to continue doing that.
Very good. I'm seeing the same in my university, students using their voice and using social media channels to get it out. So that's great. We are now at 1/4 and I know that Abersade, you have had your hand up and you would like to join the conversation. So let's go to you first on whatever you'd like to add to the talk today.
Yeah, I would say thank you very much. Is my voice okay? Yeah.
Yes, can hear you. Thank you.
That was what all of you said is very thoughtful. I just want to concentrate on the idea of training and how can training be effective. Like we speak about anything cannot be just given out of context. Like when we spoke about the gender mainstreaming project of IAWRT, what made it better project is that we concentrated, we worked in different countries. we shared experience, and then we put this in a book, and then we did evaluation and a follow-up. The same what we are doing in training. So training starts, I tried giving safety training in 2001, around 19 years ago. And I did that because I saw the safety training is for everyone, and the women should be really customized. But what really took this to another better level was customizing those kind of training, and then coming back to put safety handbook for the women training that speaks for them. That was issued in 2017. And then yesterday we have had an English version of this. So it's not only training as a training, it's just trying to get best examples, case studies. And I mean, this handbooks that we put Michelle's examples, because it's really was very environments. We put things from the CPJ, from the others. So those kinds of things is really valuable. And then we evaluate those examples. And the issue is that to customize the trainings and to customize, when we speak about women journalists, we don't speak only on the journalists who work with full-time, because this is realistically who now, how is the number or percentage of journalists and female journalists who work full-time. And I think a lot of them now, a lot of us are freelancers. So we have to really direct more of the programs to the freelancers. Another thing, when we speak about that, we should be speaking about as well journalists, local journalists who work in the new media, because this is the new reality. In coronavirus here, catastrophic, people who are in those countries are hearing about those awareness things coming from other media houses, but they will really implement what they hear from the local ones. So let's really, if we're going to update our policies, concentrate to create models that is suitable for the small and medium, and especially the small and medium medias and the freelance and the local journalists. I think this will be more powerful. I'll share here the link of the safety handbook in Arabic and English. And thank you everyone for giving me the platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that contribution. And yes, if you could put that in the chat field. The chat field will be preserved, and we'll figure out a way to share these resources more widely. Other questions, you can either enter your question in chat or simply unmute and ask a question.
Patty, can I just make a quick, I wanted to note, because you mentioned, Abir mentioned freelancers, and it would be, I think, remiss of us not to recognize that we're doing this amid coronavirus, which has fundamentally reconfigured journalism and the journalistic field, and is probably, I'm going to, in my personal capacity, say probably having an outsized impact on women journalists who are also overwhelmingly caretakers, working from home, thinking about all of that. I wanted to note that there are several organizations that are providing support and grants to journalists. Every journalist is a coronavirus journalist now, right? So I know that the International Women's Media Foundation has a fund, Internews has a fund. We are also, of course, continuing to provide emergency support and safety information for journalists reporting on coronavirus. But I think we want to recognize that as we're talking about the changes that have taken place in the past 25 years, we're seeing a massive change take place right now as we all figure out how to do journalism, how to support journalists in the time of coronavirus.
Excellent point, because it has, of course, reordered all of our lives and how we're working, and I think it's going to have a lasting impact on the field of journalism. And can't neglect to mention that, yes, women are typically the caretakers, and now very often are at home trying to care for children, other family members, run a household, and maintain their work schedules is very difficult. Other comments, questions?
Patty, I just want to add to that, especially in higher ed, as we are pushing our classes and the way we do our work online as well. We have put our students behind a screen and made inaccessible to them the kinds of supports that they need to support them from online harassment and threats and other kinds of things that are going to be heightened in this particular time period. I've seen god-awful videos from Zoom of people doing things they shouldn't be doing, that they don't understand the technology and the ability to be able to maintain their privacy online. And obviously my concerns at the top of this call about Zoom bombing and the ways in which the technology can go sideways. And so I'd really encourage us to look deeply at how society is changing as a result, and the outsized impact that online threats will have in an environment where everybody's online.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Patty, may I just come in?
Purna, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to endorse what Michelle was saying again, but also to pick up a couple of points that were being made about the denial of sexual harassment being an issue. I think that was about Eastern Europe and Romania. And about the international reach and relevance of Me Too. First of all, I think every time women have pushed to have anything put on the agenda, we've been told it's not relevant here. It doesn't apply here. Whether it's rape in marriage, whether it's child abuse, everywhere that is the nature of the pushback, and we should anticipate and expect that in every way and be ready for it. You know, I've done some work in Georgia recently and in Albania around sexual harassment. We've been looking at what's been happening on Twitter. I said earlier that I think the Me Too movement has been the most effective, the most remarkable, phenomenal global engagement around sexual harassment or sexual violence of any sort that we've ever seen. It was spontaneous, it had massive reach, and it resonated with women, primarily women, all over the world. We've been able to look at what's happened on Twitter, not the whole of social media, but what's happened on Twitter. And I just want to share with you, just to dispel the idea that a lot of people have that this is about America, Hollywood, or the elite. So looking at Twitter in the period up to December last year, we've seen, I think, 25 million impressions on Twitter using Me Too, the hashtag. And that spread goes all the way from US and Canada, where the largest single number is in the US, but Argentina had 2.5 million. India had 1.5 million. Japan had over 1 million. Spain had 1.2 million. Indonesia, UAE, Iran, in every country of the world, there has been some engagement and with Me Too, and it has been seen as obviously relevant. What is also true is that whenever women speak up about things they're not supposed to talk about, it is risky and it remains risky. And the nature of that risk, I think, is part of the creativity of misogyny, which is endlessly creative and always finding new ways to ensure that women are told their place and know they should keep quiet. You know, from a young woman, a young schoolgirl being killed in Bangladesh for denouncing her school headmaster for sexual harassment, to people being exiled from their countries in Pakistan and other places. I think this is the latest wave and the latest version of how women's voices have been raised and are extremely powerful. And at the same time, that contestation that comes from those who don't want to give away power. I initially framed this whole discussion as about inequality in power. And that's why we must understand this contestation. This dialectic will be continuous. I do think there's some work to do around people who are not in formal workplaces. And of course, even these working from home conditions exacerbate those conditions for those circumstances for those who are normally in an office or a factory or a shop. I just want to flag that we're trying to do some work around sexual harassment and people who don't have formal engaged employee status. And my colleague who's online, Celeste, would be really happy to connect around freelance journalists to take this forward a little bit more. So I think my overall point is that Me Too has really changed public discussion in a way that nothing else has. And while some governments, whether it's Romania or elsewhere, might say this is not our issue, they're not the ones we're listening to. We're listening to those on the front line who know that this is their issue. And we take it to the legislators, the policymakers, etc., and say, it's your obligation now to do something about it, because this is discrimination and inequality that you've all signed up to end. So let's get on with it.
Very good. Great perspectives. Do we have other questions, folks who have not had a chance to weigh in, who would like to weigh in?
I will give my thing to Racheal, because since she came in late. Racheal, you want to take my point there?
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Diana and Purna, the colleague from the university, was talking about the students and what we need to do. I think one of the things that I wanted to weigh in on is that a lot of the issues that we are getting especially those of us in media houses who are practicing, is we are kind of fighting fire. When the students come, they come, you know, they get, they're met with this rude awakening about the real life situation in the newsrooms. And sometimes their only way is to exit, you know, the newsrooms, or to take on other softer jobs, or to just leave. So what IAWRT has been doing in Kenya, and we see it bearing fruit, is that we are now engaging with the universities, partnering with the universities. We have identified accomplished media women who are willing to work with the students in media, the female journalism students. We have done this. This is the third year. We did it with the University of Nairobi. Last year, we did it with Maseno University. This year, we're actually doing it with 4 different universities, public universities. It's bearing fruit because I think while in school, sometimes we get lost in sticking to the curriculum and sticking to the professional requirements and stuff, and forget that they're also working within a community or within a society with so many challenges. So we are taking the holistic approach where we're working with these girls. Each of the mentors is now working with 4 girls. And by the end of the year, going by what we saw last year, you're able to identify their challenges, you're able to guide them, and you're able to even collaborate with their teachers on areas that you feel they're feeling challenges that they may have been shy to discuss in school. And even issues of online harassment have come on very strongly. We are focused on looking at media ethics, digital media, safety, and leadership. And that has worked marvelously, especially last year when we were working with the Maseno University. We'll be sharing some of the clips on the IAWRT the testimonies on the IAWRT website that you can share with us. But I think over and above the school curriculum and the school program, we are urging the media women to go an extra mile to work with those students, so that by the time they get to the media houses, they're not shocked. They're not fighting. We're not fighting fire. They're already, you know, acclimatized and.
Oh no!
Great.
Yeah, and stay in media.
Very good. You froze for a second, but that's yet, you know, we've been talking a lot about the problems, but also solutions. And what Racheal just offered is a solution at a very personal level, mentoring women, students, to bring them into the workplace so that they don't give up before they barely get started, help them navigate what can be complicated work environments. So everything from policy to training to mentoring has been mentioned as helpful in all the issues that we're talking about. Is there a final question or two as we get down to 11:28? I'm going to go first to Diana. Yes, thank you. Sheila, did you want to pipe in first?
No, at the end, I will give Abir, who is the Vice President for National, Abir Sahadi, who is from Egypt, Germany now, to give the final go ahead and, you know, close kind of with you.
Sure, very good. Diana first.
I just wanted to reaffirm what Purna was saying on the importance for women in those countries, in Eastern European settings, or I'm sure in other settings around the world, the idea that women need to push back, whether through social media, which is a potential equalizer, whether through governmental organizations or non-governmental organizations, pushing back on governments that refuse to admit that there is sexual harassment, that there are issues out there in their countries, in their regions that are being refused to be addressed. The importance of having women journalists and women across professions pushing back and saying, yes, these topics do exist, and yes, we do have issues in these areas in which our governments do not want to admit that the problem even exists. I also wanted to say that while COVID-19 is has potential to reduce workplace harassment in the traditional sense, it also has, of course, Michelle mentioned that it would increase online possibilities for harassment and abuse, but it would also increase other possibilities of harassment and abuse, domestic, the isolation that leads to the potential for domestic abuse, the possibility to actually increase social inequality and social injustice. Those who are have-nots will have even less than they had before. And the more we go from the Western world and developed countries towards developing nations, we will have more of those issues. And I wanted to highlight how important it is to continue to do research on these aspects and have the large organizations provide funding for research so that we would know what's going on and we would be able to provide support, based training on research data and so on in these areas. One last aspect that I wanted to mention is that in our IAWRT study on women's representation in media venues, it's a smaller study. We only had several countries involved, but what's important is that we looked at what other populations are silenced other than women. And it's important to mention that ethnic minorities and sexual minorities are among the most silenced and the most at risk, including in a time like now, in which again, isolation leads to potentially even more abuse for those groups.
Very good. We're going to end with some comments from Abir before we sign off.
I think I'm going to do it.
Okay, thank you.
We changed. Okay, so what I want, I'd like to just add something here. You know, with putting everything together that everyone has said, contributed to this, and it's particularly about Black journalists and ownership, which I think Michelle mentioned. I just want to put one line out there. Black journalists are redlined. And we know what the red line was of Black communities being redlined after the GI Bill and all that. I don't think I need to get into that. We don't have time for that. The banks will not lend Black journalists money to start business in I'm talking about the United States now, where I am at the moment. In other countries, it will be different, but it's mostly NGOs, international organizations that are lending, for instance, community radio women to start radio station. Next thing you know, they get burnt down by the government and that sort of thing. I think when we talk about women and the advancement of women or the empowerment of women or whichever way it goes, we have to sometimes dissect the women's movement and the feminist movement to say, to see that it doesn't really direct itself to Black women, Black and brown women that much. We have to really claw our way in and fight, because while others are rising, Black women are still in the same situation. And the last thing is about the Me Too campaign. The Me Too campaign should have started a long time ago when Black journalists are crying out loud, I'm being raped, help me. It wasn't happening. They lose their jobs, they're working incognito, they can't use their own names, and that is really, really bad. So these are some of the things that I'd like to see, especially the research organizations and media, universities, academics, and so on, take into account when you're training students to prepare them for what's out there. And for the new kind of a journalism, it's not the same as it used to be. Finally, I just want to say that I want to throw a question out there about why is it that journalists are not supported by the public? Why is it that the Me Too campaign was about journalists and other women organizations weren't really supporting journalists? Once upon a time, as a journalist, you're from your community and your community has your back. now it's not so. What do we need to do? And this may be, a question for Purna and all of us, but Purna, because you're doing a lot of research and stuff going on out there, what do we need to do to get the public's trust so that we can get the kind of support that we need, that we're here to bring them information and to work for them, to bring them the truth and that sort of thing. I work in peacekeeping for many years, and I see how governments treat journalists, and the people the journalists who will make it and survive even death are those who have the trust of the community from which they came. And I just want to say thank you, Patty, and thanks to everyone that participated in this event today.
Thank you, Sheila. That is a very big question, earning back trust and the support of the public, which has been eroded during the Trump administration. And we'll save that for a different day. And with that, want to thank all of you who joined the conversation: Michelle Ferrier, Purna Sen, Courtney Racheal, Diana Nastasia, and Mahi Ferreira. Thank you very much for being part of the conversation. And best to all of you as you shelter in place across the globe.
And thanks to Jennifer Royer.
Thank you very much to Jennifer Royer for her great assistance. As always, she is a great treasure to SPJ. Thank you so much. Take care, and we'll send out a follow-up note based on the chat field and some of the conversation here today. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.